The sound of the auctioneer's gavel still rings in my ears. Bright studio lights glared down on me, hot enough to sting my eyes, but not as much as the shame did. I stood at the edge of the stage, surrounded by strangers who were cheering and laughing. People who knew nothing about me, about my life, about what those piles of junk really meant. And there he was, my son, Ethan, standing behind the podium in a crisp suit, grinning like he'd just won something. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said into the microphone, "today we're cleaning out decades of hoarding. My father has been living buried under his junk for years, and it's time to let it go." The audience chuckled. Someone yelled, "About time!" My stomach twisted. Junk? He was calling the story of my life junk on national television. The cameras zoomed in on my face, probably catching every wrinkle of disbelief. I wanted to speak, to tell them this wasn't what it looked like. But the lump in my throat wouldn't let me. Ethan's voice filled the studio again. "Let's start the bidding with this old jewelry box. Dad says it belonged to Mom, but we'll let the expert decide if it's worth anything." He held it up for the audience to see, a small, ornate wooden box with gold inlays and faded velvet lining. My late wife, Margaret, had adored it. It was one of the few things she left behind before cancer took her from me 12 years ago. She used to say the box had a story older than either of us. I never knew what she meant, but I kept it safe, like a piece of her heart. Now it sat in my son's hands, turned into a prop for entertainment. The antique expert, a man with silver hair and thick glasses, stepped forward. "Let's take a closer look, shall we?" He examined it under a magnifying glass, rotating it slowly. The audience waited, half bored, half amused. Then something changed. The man froze, his eyebrows arched, and he looked at Ethan, then at me. The room went silent. You could hear the faint hum of the cameras and the nervous cough of a producer off stage. "Sir," the expert said carefully, "where did you say this came from?" Ethan laughed awkwardly. "From my dad's attic. He collects everything." The expert placed the box gently on the podium. His voice trembled. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is no ordinary trinket. This right here is the missing piece from the royal collection of the late 1700s. It was thought lost for centuries." He paused, letting the words sink in. "It's worth approximately $50 million. The audience gasped. Ethan's smile vanished. My knees nearly gave out. I remember the lights flickering, the murmurs rising, reporters rushing toward the stage. Ethan looked at me like he'd just seen a ghost. For the first time, the man who had mocked my junk couldn't speak. As the expert continued explaining the box's history, all I could do was stare at my son. My heart ached, not because of the money, but because of the emptiness behind his eyes. Somewhere along the way, he'd lost the ability to see value in anything that didn't shine on a screen. I whispered, barely audible, "It was never junk, Ethan. It was love." And that's how my story began, the day my son auctioned off my life on live television and accidentally uncovered the treasure that would change everything. Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. Before all of this, before the cameras, before the betrayal, before my own son called me a hoarder, I had a quiet life. Some might have called it small, but to me, it was full. Every morning, I woke to the sound of birds outside my old farmhouse window. The air always smelled faintly of oak and dusted books, and the first light of day would catch the glass trinkets Margaret had hung by the kitchen window years ago. They still made tiny rainbows on the counter every morning. That house was more than 4 walls. It was a museum of our life together. Each item had a story. The cracked tea set on the shelf was from our honeymoon in Savannah. The old record player? That was how Margaret and I danced in the living room every Friday night, even after her diagnosis. When she was too weak to stand, I'd sit beside her, and we'd sway in rhythm from our chairs, pretending we were still 20. After she passed, I couldn't bring myself to change much. I tried once. I packed away a few of her dresses, But when I opened the closet a week later, it looked too empty, like erasing her would erase the years we built. So, I put them back. People called it holding on. I called it remembering. I stayed busy restoring old furniture for neighbors. It was something I was good at: cleaning, sanding, polishing, bringing something forgotten back to life. Maybe that's why I loved antiques so much. They reminded me that things and people could be worn down and still be beautiful. Ethan used to visit on Sundays. He'd drive down from Boston wearing his city suit and expensive watch. I'd cook pot roast just like his mom used to, and we'd eat while I told him stories about how I'd found a new antique at the local fair. He'd nod politely, scrolling through his phone under the table. "Dad," he'd say without looking up, "you've got to get rid of some of this stuff. It's getting out of hand." I'd chuckle. "You sound just like your mother. She would have wanted you to move on." "Moving on doesn't mean forgetting, son." He'd sigh, stand up, and start stacking dishes like he was racing a clock. I used to think his restlessness was just ambition. He was building a career in television production, always chasing the next big story, the next bright light. I was proud of him for that. I told everyone my boy worked in media, though I never really understood what kind of shows he made. When he left each Sunday, I'd stand on the porch, waving as his car disappeared down the dirt road. I always told myself he'd slow down one day, that we'd sit together again and really talk like we used to. Looking back now, I see it clearly. My life then was a fragile piece built on memories. I thought love and family were unshakable things, the kind you could trust to stay even when time took everything else. I didn't know that my own sense of comfort, those morning rainbows, the soft hum of old records, the familiar creak of the kitchen floor, would become the very things my son would later mock in front of millions. But back then, in those quiet mornings and gentle evenings, I was content. I thought I had all the time in the world to fix what was slowly cracking between us. I was wrong. It started small, so small I almost missed it. Looking back, it wasn't one big explosion that broke us apart, but a series of tiny cracks that widened over time until everything fell through. One Saturday afternoon, Ethan showed up unannounced. I was in the shed, polishing an old brass telescope I'd found at a flea market. The thing was rusted and bent, but I could tell it had history, hand-carved base, intricate detailing. I'd been working on it for days, taking my time. That kind of slow work gave me peace. "Dad!" Ethan's voice echoed from the yard. I smiled, wiping my hands on my apron. "Out here, son?" I called back. He stepped into the shed, filming with his phone. "What's all this?" he asked, panning the camera around. "The Smithsonian called. They want their junk pile back." I laughed at first, thinking he was just being his usual sarcastic self, but the camera didn't turn off. He kept walking around, filming my shelves stacked with old radios, clocks, and dusty frames. "Say hi to my followers, Dad. They've been asking what it's like living with a real-life hoarder." That word, hoarder, hit me like a slap. I forced a smile. "Come on, Ethan, don't post that." "It's just for fun," he said, grinning. "People love this stuff. It's harmless." I wanted to believe him. I told myself he was joking, that maybe he just didn't understand what these things meant to me. He grew up surrounded by technology and instant results. To him, an old radio was just junk taking up space. To me, it was a connection to another time, a reminder of conversations I once had with Margaret, sitting by the fire, tuning into stations that barely came through. A few days later, I was making coffee when my phone buzzed. It was a message from my old neighbor, Mrs. Parker. "Robert, I saw Ethan's video. You're famous." Curious, I opened the link. There it was, my shed, my home, my life, edited into a 3-minute clip with upbeat music and captions like, "Dad's antique addiction. Would you survive this mess?" It had over 200,000 views. The comments stung worse than anything. "Poor guy's lost it. That house must smell like the 1800s. His son needs to call a cleanup crew, not a camera crew." I closed the app, my hands shaking. I told myself it didn't matter, that strangers on the internet couldn't touch what I had. But something shifted in me that day. I started to see my home differently, not through my eyes, but through theirs. Every old item suddenly looked like a flaw exposed to the world. When Ethan called that evening, I tried to sound normal. "People really liked it," he said, proud. "You're kind of a hit, Dad." "I'd appreciate it if you'd take it down," I said quietly. He sighed. "It's just a video, Dad. Don't take everything so personally." We didn't argue, but the space between us grew thicker, heavier. After that, he didn't visit for weeks. I caught myself checking my phone sometimes, wondering if he'd call, not because I was angry, but because I missed him. I missed the boy who used to sit in the living room with me, asking questions about the world. The one who once said, "Dad, you make history sound alive." Now he was the one burying it. I told myself it was just a misunderstanding. Families go through rough patches. But deep down, I knew. That moment in the shed, the laughter, the phone camera, the word hoarder, wasn't harmless. It was the first red flag, the first tiny tear in the thread that held us together. After that video, something between us quietly shifted. Ethan stopped calling as often. When he did, his tone had changed, colder, impatient, as if every conversation with me was a task he needed to check off. At first, I told myself he was just busy. He worked long hours in television, chasing deadlines and sponsors. That's what I wanted to believe. But the truth? He wasn't busy. He was pulling away. One Sunday, months after the video, he finally visited. He didn't bring flowers or sit for dinner like he used to. He came armed with trash bags and cleaning supplies. "Dad, we need to talk," he said, standing in the doorway like a social worker. "About what?" He looked around, eyes sweeping over the living room where Margaret's picture sat on the mantel. "About this mess. You can't live like this anymore." It wasn't a mess. It was my life, my history. Every clock, every photo, every book had a purpose. But in his eyes, it was all just clutter. "I like things the way they are," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He sighed. "You don't see it, Dad. This isn't healthy. You're stuck in the past." He started packing boxes before I could protest. Margaret's old shawl, my grandfather's pipe, even the faded postcards from the 1960s, places she and I dreamed of visiting. "Ethan, please. Those aren't just things." He didn't stop. "They're holding you back. You need space to move forward." That day, I sat in my armchair while my son cleaned out. My life. The sound of items clinking into boxes felt like nails in a coffin. I wanted to yell, to stop him, but I couldn't find the strength. He wasn't trying to be cruel. I could see that. He truly thought he was helping. That was the hardest part, being hurt by someone who believed he was saving you. After he left, the silence in the house felt heavier than usual. The living room looked cleaner, yes, but emptier, like someone had drained the soul from it. I stared at the bare walls and realized I didn't recognize my own home anymore. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing smaller things. He'd text instead of calling. When he did call, it was usually about logistics. "Did you sign the donation papers? Are you ready for the cleanup crew next weekend?" He spoke to me the way a manager talks to a client. No warmth, no laughter. At night, I'd walk through the house, touching the spaces where things used to be. I'd imagine Margaret's laugh echoing through the hall, her voice teasing me, "You'd lose your head if it weren't attached." I missed that noise, the music of a home that once felt alive. One morning, I found a note taped to the front door. Ethan had stopped by while I was out. It read, "We're filming a new segment soon. It could help you. Please don't be stubborn. Help me." The words stuck with me all day. He wasn't asking anymore. He was deciding for me. The boy who once ran into my arms after baseball games now looked at me like a problem to solve. That was the cruelest erosion of all. Not the loss of things, but the loss of being seen. I wasn't his father anymore. I was a project. And though I didn't know it yet, that help he was planning would soon become the greatest humiliation of my life. The day it happened started like any other. I woke early, made coffee, and sat by the window, watching the light hit the trees in the yard. It was peaceful, one of those quiet mornings that remind you the world isn't all bad. Then the phone rang. "Dad, big news!" Ethan's voice came through, bright and fast. "A network wants to feature you on a special episode. They're doing a series about families and letting go. It'll be great exposure for both of us." I hesitated. "Exposure for what, son?" "For you, for your collection. People will see the cool stuff you've kept. Maybe you'll even sell a few things." He sounded so excited. For a moment, I let myself believe him. Maybe this was his way of reconnecting, sharing something we both could be proud of. So I said yes. A week later, a van pulled into the driveway. Out stepped a full camera crew, boom mics, lights, producers with clipboards. They moved fast, turning my home into a stage. I remember one woman saying, "Perfect, this clutter is gold on camera." That was the first time my chest tightened. Ethan greeted them like an old friend, shaking hands, laughing, directing people where to stand. He looked so at ease, so in control. He handed me a clean shirt and said, "Just be yourself, Dad. Be natural." "Ethan," I whispered, "this isn't about hoarders, is it?" He gave me that same boyish grin he used to flash when he was caught doing something wrong. "Don't worry, Dad. Trust me." I wanted to. God help me, I wanted to. When the cameras started rolling, the host, a tall, smiling woman with perfect hair, walked through the door and gasped dramatically. "Wow, that's a lot of stuff," she said to the camera. The crew laughed. I stood frozen, unsure whether to defend myself or smile along. Ethan jumped in saying, "Yeah, my dad's been collecting for decades. We've been trying to help him move on from all this junk." Junk. That word again. The one that had turned my life into a punchline. They followed me from room to room, asking questions that made me sound helpless. "How long have you been living like this? Do you ever feel trapped? Why do you hold on to so many useless items?" Each word chipped away at me, and each time I opened my mouth, the host would cut me off with another quip. The audience watching at home would never hear the truth, that these weren't just objects, but pieces of my family, my memories, my wife. Then came the final insult. They brought in an auctioneer, someone Ethan knew from the network. "Let's see what treasures we can uncover," he shouted, clapping his hands. They placed one of Margaret's boxes on the table, the little wooden jewelry box she had cherished. My heart sank. "Be careful," I said softly. "That belonged to your mother." The host laughed. "Maybe Mom had better taste than we think." The audience burst out laughing. I felt the heat rise to my face. My chest ached. The world around me blurred into noise. Applause, jokes, flashing cameras. I wanted to leave, to pull the plug on the whole thing, but my feet wouldn't move. Somewhere deep inside, a voice whispered that walking away would only make me look guilty, weak. So I stood there, smiling through the pain, humiliated on live television, while my son turned my memories into a spectacle. When it ended and the camera shut off, Ethan patted my shoulder. "You did great, Dad. The audience is going to love it." But I didn't feel great. I felt hollow, like something inside me had cracked beyond repair. That night, I sat in the empty house, the lights off, my reflection faint in the TV screen. I wasn't angry yet, just numb. Because somewhere deep down, I already knew this wasn't the end of my humiliation. It was only the beginning. After the show aired, my life changed in ways I never could have imagined, and not for the better. The first time I saw the broadcast, I was sitting alone in the living room, a mug of coffee in my hands. I told myself I'd only watch a few minutes just to see how it turned out. Maybe somehow Ethan had made it look kind. Maybe the edit wasn't as cruel as it felt in person, but it was worse. They'd added dramatic music, quick cuts, and captions that flashed across the screen like headlines, "Local man trapped in the past." A family intervention goes viral. The host called me a sweet but lost soul, and Ethan, my own son, smiled for the camera as the brave caretaker helping his father heal. The internet lit up with comments. Strangers debated my life like it was a game. Some pitied me, others mocked me. The clip went viral. Overnight, I became the hoarder dad. People even showed up at my house, hoping to take pictures or peek through the windows. The world thought I was broken, and maybe at that point, I was. Ethan stopped answering my calls for a few days after the premiere. When he finally did, his voice was brisk, professional. "Dad, the response has been amazing. Networks are reaching out for follow-ups. This could open doors for both of us." "For both of us?" I repeated. "Ethan, you turned my life into a circus. Do you understand that?" He hesitated. "It wasn't supposed to hurt you, Dad. It was supposed to help." "Help me how? By making me a joke?" There was silence on the line, and then he said, "You don't see it, do you? People care now. You needed a push to let go." That was when I realized we weren't speaking the same language anymore. I was talking about love and memory. He was talking about content and reach. After that, I couldn't stay in that house, not because I didn't love it, but because it no longer felt like mine. My neighbors looked at me differently. A few came by with casseroles or awkward sympathy, but most just whispered when I passed. The home that once felt sacred now felt like a stage that had been stripped of its set. So, one morning, without ceremony or goodbye, I packed a few essentials, some clothes, my late wife's letters, and a single small box I couldn't bear to part with. I left the key on the kitchen table. I rented a small room above a used bookstore in town. It wasn't much, just a bed, a lamp, and a window that overlooked Main Street. But it was quiet. The kind of quiet that lets you think and feel and grieve without being watched. I thought about calling Ethan, telling him where I was, but I didn't. He didn't ask either. I suppose both of us needed distance. In the evenings, I'd walk past shop windows glowing with warm light, families laughing over dinner, couples holding hands. I'd think of Margaret and the life we built, the one Ethan was born into, and how strange it was to lose it all, not to death but to misunderstanding. I wasn't angry anymore, just tired. I told myself maybe it was time to start over, to live smaller, quieter, freer. Everyone who watched that show assumed I'd given up, that I was finished. But deep down, in that tiny rented room above the bookstore, something inside me refused to die. A small spark of dignity still burned, and one day soon I would need it. The winter that followed was the coldest I'd ever felt, not because of the weather, but because of the silence that filled my life. My room above the bookstore was small, barely big enough for a chair, and a narrow bed. The walls were thin, and I could hear the faint sound of pages turning downstairs, the muffled chatter of customers during the day. At night, everything went still, the kind of stillness that makes you hear your own thoughts a little too clearly. I lived simply, instant coffee in the mornings, soup from a can at night. My only luxury was the small wooden box I'd brought with me. Margaret's box. The same one that had been mocked on live television, the same one I'd begged Ethan not to touch. I kept it wrapped in an old towel, hidden under the bed like a secret I wasn't ready to let the world hurt again. Some nights I'd take it out, running my fingers over the faded carvings. Margaret used to say it had a story. Older than us, she'd tell me, smiling. Back then, I thought it was just romantic nonsense, a poetic thing she said to make the ordinary feel magical. But now, sitting alone in a dim room, that idea brought me comfort. Maybe she was right. Maybe it did have a story. Still, most nights, I didn't think about the box. I thought about Ethan. I'd replay the last few months over and over, wondering where I went wrong. I'd been a good father, or at least I tried. I wasn't perfect, but I was present. I worked hard. I stayed after school to help students. I made sure Ethan had every chance I never did. And now, after everything, I couldn't even remember the last time he'd said, I love you. Once I saw his face on TV again. He was giving an interview about the success of the show, smiling that same polished smile, talking about how it had brought attention to families struggling with attachment issues. That's what I was to him now, an issue. I turned the TV off, but his words kept echoing in my head. Outside, the snow piled against the window. I wrapped myself in a blanket, feeling the ache in my chest grow heavier with every breath. For the first time in my life, I felt truly invisible. Not because the world couldn't see me, but because the one person who mattered most no longer wanted to. I tried distracting myself by helping out at the bookstore. The owner, an older woman named Clara, would sometimes ask me to repair old bindings or polish antique lamps customers brought in. It helped. It gave me purpose. But when she'd go home for the night and lock the doors, I'd sit by the window, watching the glow of the street lamps on the snow. The world looked peaceful from up there, like it belonged to someone else. I wasn't angry anymore, just hollow. The lowest point came one night when I woke to the sound of a news anchor mentioning the auction again. They were replaying the clip of the antique expert gasping the moment he declared the jewelry box potentially priceless. Ethan's name flashed under the headline, "Producer Behind Viral Hoarder Redemption Story." They didn't mention me, not once. I turned off the TV and sat there in the dark, holding the real box in my hands. My fingers traced the gold inlay, worn but still elegant. For the first time, I whispered to it, not to the cameras, not to anyone else, just to her. "Margaret, what did you see in this thing? What did you see in me?" No answer came, but somehow I felt less alone. And that night, before I fell asleep, I made myself a quiet promise. This wouldn't be the end of my story, not yet. It happened on a Thursday, one of those cold, gray afternoons when the sky feels heavy and time moves slower. I'd just come back from running errands, bread, coffee, a new bulb for the lamp in my room. When I opened the door, a small white envelope was waiting on the floor, slipped under the threshold. My name was written in neat, unfamiliar handwriting. Inside was a business card, Lewis Harding, Senior Antique Consultant, and a note. "Mr. Callahan, we need to talk about the wooden jewelry box featured on the auction show. Please call me at your earliest convenience. L. Harding." My heart skipped. I remembered him, the expert from the show, the man who had examined Margaret's box, the one who looked startled before declaring it valuable. Back then, I'd barely registered what he'd said. I was too humiliated to care. I sat on the bed staring at the card. Why would he be reaching out now? Months had passed. The world had moved on. Ethan certainly had. But something about the tone of that message felt urgent. I dialed the number. "Mr. Callahan," came a calm, professional voice. "Thank you for calling. I've been trying to reach you. May I ask, do you still have possession of that box?" "Yes," I said slowly. "Why?" There was a pause, then his tone softened. "I believe you may not realize what you have." That sentence hung in the air like a chord that refused to resolve. We met the next day in the back room of the bookstore. Lewis was a tall man in his 70s, with silver hair and the kind of voice that carried quiet authority. He placed a velvet cloth on the table and motioned for me to set the box on top. He examined it carefully under the lamp, running his fingers over the carvings, opening the lid, and studying the tiny hinges. Then he turned it upside down, tapping lightly at the base. "Do you see this symbol?" he asked, pointing to a small crest I'd always assumed was just decoration. I nodded. My wife said it looked like a crown. "It is," he said. "That's the royal insignia of the House of Pembroke, late 1700s. This box wasn't made for sale. It was commissioned." He produced a small tool from his pocket and gently pried open one of the base panels. My breath caught. Inside, folded neatly, was a piece of parchment, browned with age, but still intact. He unfolded it carefully, and I caught sight of faded handwriting, and an embossed seal. "This," he whispered, "is an authentication certificate. It proves this box was part of the royal collection, a personal gift to Lady Catherine Pembroke, lost after the estate fire in 1792. I sat back speechless. My wife's story older than us wasn't just romantic nonsense. She had known, or at least felt, that this piece carried something sacred. Lewis looked up. "Mr. Callahan, this is not only authentic, it's priceless. The missing piece historians have been searching for." I felt my throat tighten. So all this time, what they called junk was history, he finished gently. For the first time in years, I didn't feel foolish for holding on. I felt seen. Margaret had been right all along. She always said some things find you for a reason, and now I understood why. When Lewis left, I sat alone in that little room, the box open before me. Sunlight filtered through the window, landing perfectly on the royal crest. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I just whispered, "You were right, Maggie." In that quiet moment, surrounded by dust and memory, something inside me woke up. For days after Mr. Harding's visit, I couldn't stop staring at that jewelry box. It sat on the small table by the window, catching the afternoon light, the royal crest gleaming like a secret reborn. Every time I looked at it, I felt something stirring in me, something I thought I'd lost long ago. It wasn't about the money. It never was. It was about truth, about dignity, about the quiet reminder that I hadn't been crazy for holding on to the past. I'd been right to trust my instincts, to believe that memory and meaning matter, even when the world laughs at you for it. For months, I'd been walking around like a ghost, eating, sleeping, breathing, but not living. Now, for the first time in years, I felt a pulse again. I started waking up earlier just to open the curtains and let the light in. I'd make my coffee and sit by the window, notebook in hand, jotting down everything I remembered about where the box had come from. Margaret had told me once that she'd found it in an old estate sale in Virginia years before we married. "It called to me," she'd said. Back then, I thought she was just being sentimental. Now I realized she'd felt its history. She always could sense when something carried a story. So I started writing, not just about the box, but about her, about our life together, about how the world had changed, and how I had let it swallow me whole. I wrote for hours every day, my hands aching, but my mind alive. Then one morning, I picked up the phone and called Mr. Harding. "I want to do this right," I told him. "If this piece truly belongs to history, I want it authenticated properly. I don't want the networks or my son involved. This isn't about publicity." He agreed immediately. "You have my word, Mr. Callahan. We'll keep it quiet until everything is confirmed." That was the beginning of my quiet comeback. While the world still saw me as the hoarder dad, I started meeting with historians and appraisers behind the scenes. I listened, I learned, and for the first time in a long time, I felt useful again. My years as a history teacher, all those dusty lectures and field trips, it all came rushing back. And every night when I came back to my little room above the bookstore, I'd take out Margaret's box, run my fingers over its carved edges, and whisper, "We're not done yet, are we?" It was as if she was still with me, guiding me forward. One evening, Clara, the bookstore owner, noticed the change in me. "You look lighter," she said, handing me a cup of tea. "Whatever's happening, don't let it go." "I won't," I told her. And I meant it. I no longer felt like a man defined by what was taken from him. I felt like someone rediscovering his purpose. The same spark that once made me fall in love with teaching, with Margaret, with life itself, it was back. The world had taken my pride, my name, even my home. But it hadn't taken my spirit. It had only buried it. And now it was clawing its way back to the surface. I wasn't ready to forgive Ethan yet. But I no longer needed his approval to exist. For the first time, I understood what real strength was, not shouting, not proving, just knowing. And deep down, I sensed something even greater was coming, something that would prove to everyone, especially my son, that truth and love outlast everything else. After the discovery, something in me shifted from mourning to motion. I didn't tell Ethan. I didn't tell anyone, not even Clara at the bookstore. I just started moving quietly, deliberately, as if guided by a rhythm no one else could hear. For the first time in years, my steps had purpose. Each morning, I'd shave, dress neatly, and head into town. Not the beaten-down man the world had seen on TV, but the teacher, the historian, the man my wife fell in love with. Mr. Harding introduced me to a network of historians, appraisers, and legal experts who specialized in lost artifacts. They met with me discreetly, often after hours, in small offices filled with books and the faint smell of dust and polish. I kept meticulous notes, provenance documents, authentication certificates, correspondence with museums. Every detail mattered. The more I learned, the clearer it became that Margaret's box wasn't just valuable, it was legendary. It had been missing from official records for more than 2 centuries. Museums had offered rewards for its recovery, and private collectors had searched for it in vain. Now it was in my hands. One evening, as I sat in that small, rented room surrounded by papers, I caught sight of myself in the mirror. For the first time in years, I didn't see a broken man. I saw someone rebuilding, slowly, silently, but with conviction. I wasn't planning revenge. I wasn't even angry anymore. What I wanted was truth. I wanted to reclaim my story from the hands of people who twisted it for ratings and pity. I wanted my name, my wife's memory, and my dignity restored. So I started building my plan. The first step was securing legal ownership of the box. That meant ensuring Ethan or the network couldn't claim it. The show's contract had fine print stating any items appraised or sold became the property of the production company. But since the piece had never been officially sold or removed from my possession, it was still mine. I had proof, dated correspondence, witness accounts, and, most importantly, the original receipt from the estate sale Margaret attended 40 years ago. I placed everything in a leather folder, neatly organized, and stored it in a safety deposit box at the local bank. Then I drafted a letter to the museum Mr. Harding had mentioned, the Pembroke Historical Society in London. I offered to lend the artifact for public display under one condition, that it be credited to Robert and Margaret Callahan, keepers of history. When the curator's response arrived weeks later, the words nearly made me cry. Mr. Callahan, it would be an honor. The authenticity has been confirmed, and we'd be privileged to tell your story alongside this extraordinary find. My hands trembled as I read it. My story. For once it wasn't being taken or mocked. It was being honored. I didn't tell Ethan any of this. Not yet. I wanted him to see, not be told. There's a power in silence, a dignity in waiting, until truth speaks for itself. Each night I locked my notes in a small case under my bed and looked out the window at the snow falling over Main Street. The people who once pitied me had long forgotten my name, but soon they'd remember. Not because I shouted, not because I fought, but because I had quietly built the foundation of my redemption, piece by piece, page by page, the way a craftsman restores something worth saving. And when the time came to reveal it, I'd be ready. Word travels quietly in small towns, even when you try to keep things private. Within a few weeks of signing the agreement with the Pembroke Historical Society, whispers began to spread. People at the bookstore started asking, "Is it true, Mr. Callahan? Did you really find something worth millions?" I'd just smile, sip my coffee, and say, "Some stories take time to be believed." For months I had lived under the weight of humiliation. Now, without doing anything loud or public, I felt the air changing. The same neighbors who had avoided eye contact after the TV show now stopped me on the street, suddenly polite, curious, almost apologetic. I didn't need their validation, but I'd be lying if I said it didn't feel good. Meanwhile, Ethan's world was starting to wobble. I saw it first on social media. The show that had humiliated me had aired its next season, but something was different. Viewers were turning on it. Comments filled with anger and regret flooded the network's page. These shows exploit people. That poor father deserved better. Reality TV has gone too far. The tide had turned, and for the first time, my silence had more power than any defense I could have given. Then came the call I wasn't expecting, Ethan's voice on the other end, hesitant, smaller than I remembered. "Dad, can we talk?" It had been months since I'd heard from him. I could hear the strain in his voice, the kind that comes when someone's confidence starts to crack. "I'm listening," I said. He hesitated. "There's some stuff going around online about the show. People are digging up old clips, twisting things. They're saying I took advantage of you." I didn't answer right away. Part of me wanted to say, "You did." But another part, the teacher, the father, knew that silence would teach him more than accusation ever could. After a long pause, I said quietly, "Truth has a way of surfacing, son. It always does." He sighed. "Dad, I didn't mean for it to go that far. I thought I was helping you." "I know what you thought," I replied, "but sometimes the damage we do in the name of helping takes longer to repair than we realize." That was all I said. No yelling, no blame, just truth, calmly delivered. And in that moment I could almost hear something shift inside him. Over the following weeks, I continued working with the museum's curators, preparing for the official announcement. They planned a press release and an exhibition unveiling in London, complete with documentation of the artifact's journey. They wanted me there, front and center. Ethan called twice more after that, each time less confident. "Are you sure you don't want me involved?" he asked once, his voice almost pleading. "I have connections. I could help with the publicity." "This isn't about publicity, Ethan," I said gently. "It's about history. Your mother understood that." He went quiet, and for the first time, I think he realized he wasn't the one holding the microphone anymore. The power wasn't in anger, revenge, or proving him wrong. It was in knowing who I was and no longer needing him to confirm it. That winter, as snow fell outside my window again, I sat in that same small room with Margaret's box resting beside me. The same object that had once made me a laughingstock was now restoring everything I'd lost: respect, purpose, peace. And all I had to do to reclaim it was stay silent and let truth do its work. The balance had shifted, and soon the world would see it too. The day of the unveiling arrived like a scene from someone else's life. The Pembroke Historical Society had transformed its grand marble hall into a gleaming display of gold, glass, and history. The missing piece of the royal collection, the box Margaret had once dusted every Sunday morning, sat beneath a soft white light, protected by glass and reverence. They'd flown me to London a few days earlier, covered my stay, and prepared me for the press conference. I'd spent the night before in my hotel room staring at my speech, rewriting the same sentence again and again. Some stories take a lifetime to be believed. When I walked onto that stage, flashbulbs burst like fireworks, reporters leaned forward, cameras clicked, and a murmur of curiosity rippled through the crowd. Behind the podium, the museum's banner read, "The Lost Heirloom of Lady Pembroke, recovered and donated by Robert and Margaret Callahan." Seeing her name there almost undid me. For a moment I imagined her in the crowd, smiling that quiet smile of hers, whispering, "You see, Rob? Some things are worth holding on to." The curator introduced me with grace, describing how the piece had been found, authenticated, and finally returned to its rightful place in history. Then he stepped aside, leaving me in front of the microphones. I took a slow breath. "I was once called a hoarder," I began, my voice echoing softly through the hall. "People laughed at the things I kept. They said I was trapped in the past. But the truth is, I never saw these things as junk. They were stories, fragments of lives that came before us, And sometimes stories are the only thing that keep us alive. The room fell silent. I could see faces soften, heads tilt slightly, as if realizing that the man in front of them wasn't the caricature they'd seen on television. I continued. This box belonged to my late wife, Margaret. She believed it had meaning long before anyone else did, and she was right. It wasn't clutter. It was history, something that connected the two of us to a world we never knew, but somehow understood. I paused, glancing at the front row. Ethan sat there, shoulders tense, eyes wide. He'd flown in last minute, uninvited but expected. For once, he didn't have a camera. He looked smaller than I remembered, not in size, but in certainty. I looked directly at him as I said my next words. I spent years thinking I'd lost everything, my wife, my home, my dignity. But sometimes, loss isn't destruction. It's revelation. It strips away what's false so truth can finally breathe. Ethan's eyes glistened, and for a moment he looked away. The crowd erupted in applause. Not the polite kind that fills silence, but the real kind. The kind that feels like understanding. After the ceremony, journalists surrounded me, asking questions about the discovery, about my story, about forgiveness. I answered calmly, giving credit where it was due. This isn't about revenge, I said. It's about remembering that the value of something isn't always visible at first glance. Sometimes it takes time and heartbreak to see clearly. When the crowd finally thinned, Ethan approached me slowly. He didn't say a word, just extended his hand. I looked at it, then at him. "You don't have to say anything, son," I said softly. "You just have to see." He nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "I see it now, Dad." And for the first time in years, I believed him. A few months after the unveiling, my life felt like it had finally found its rhythm again. The museum exhibit drew thousands of visitors. Newspapers printed stories about the humble teacher who preserved history. My name, our name, Robert and Margaret Callahan, was etched on a golden plaque beneath the glass display. But what mattered most wasn't the fame or the recognition. It was peace. For the first time in years, I could breathe without shame sitting on my chest. I could walk through the bookstore and see people smile at me, not with pity, but respect. Then, one crisp morning, I received an envelope in the mail bearing the logo of the television network that had aired my humiliation. Inside was a formal apology letter from their legal department. They admitted their portrayal had caused emotional distress and offered a settlement, a very generous one. I didn't even finish reading the amount. Instead, I set it aside and called my lawyer, instructing him to decline the money. Some victories don't need a price tag. But there was something else in that envelope, a statement attached to the network's public press release. They were canceling the Family Intervention series entirely. Citing ethical concerns and the harm caused to participants, they promised to reform their production practices. It wasn't revenge, but it was justice. A quiet, steady kind. The kind that restores balance without shouting. The real twist, though, came a week later. Mr. Harding called, his voice warm but trembling with excitement. "Robert, I thought you should hear this directly from me. The auction houses have finished the secondary valuation on the box and its contents. With the original certificate authenticated and the royal insignia verified, it's officially valued at $50 million. $50 million, I repeated, as if the number didn't belong to me. "Yes," he said. "It's history's way of paying you back for the years it took you to be believed." I hung up the phone and sat by the window for a long time, watching sunlight flicker across Main Street. $50 million. Enough to buy back every home I'd ever lost, every moment I'd been stripped of pride. But I didn't want to buy anything. Instead, I decided to give. Half of it went to the Pembroke Historical Society, ensuring Margaret's name would forever be tied to the preservation of artifacts. The other half, I donated to fund educational scholarships for students studying history and restoration work. I called it the Margaret Callahan Legacy Fund. When the news broke, people called me a philanthropist, a hero, even a living symbol of resilience. But all I felt was calm. Ethan called that night, his voice thick with emotion. "Dad, I saw what you did. I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything," I told him. "Just promise me one thing. Never mistake value for visibility. Not everything worth keeping shines under a spotlight." He didn't answer right away, but I could hear him crying softly on the other end. For once, I didn't fill the silence. I just let him be human. When I hung up, I looked around my small apartment. The air felt lighter, almost warm. Everything that had been taken from me had somehow found its way back, different, maybe, but real. The world had laughed once. Now it listened, and all I'd had to do was keep faith in what everyone else called worthless. It was a Sunday morning in early spring when Ethan came back into my life. Not as a producer, not as a man with a camera, but as a son. I was sitting in the bookstore cafe downstairs sipping my coffee and reading the local paper when I heard the door creak open. I looked up, and there he was, standing in the doorway, hesitating like a stranger, unsure if he belonged. He wasn't dressed for television this time. No tailored suit, no designer coat, just jeans, a worn jacket, and tired eyes that carried more apology than words ever could. "Hey, Dad," he said quietly. I set my cup down. "Hey, son." For a moment, we just stood there, two men separated by years of pride and silence. The sound of pages turning and distant chatter filled the space between us. Then he pulled out the chair across from me and sat down. "I didn't know if you'd want to see me," he said. "I wasn't sure if you'd want to," I replied. He gave a small, sad smile. "I've wanted to, I just didn't know how." We sat like that for a while, words slow to come but heavy with meaning. Eventually he spoke again, his voice shaky but honest. "I messed up, Dad. I thought I was doing something good. I thought if people saw you on TV, they'd understand. But I didn't realize I was trying to make myself look good, not you." I didn't interrupt him. I let him speak, really speak, for the first time in years. He went on, "When the story broke about the box, when people started praising you, I watched every interview, every article. You didn't gloat. You didn't talk about me or blame anyone. You just carried yourself with dignity. I don't think I've ever felt smaller or prouder at the same time." I took a slow breath. "Son, I wasn't trying to make you feel small. I just wanted to remind the world that worth isn't something you can measure in views or applause." He nodded, eyes glistening. "I know that now. I wish I'd known it before." For a long moment, we just sat there in silence. Then I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a small photo, one I'd kept for decades. It was of him, maybe 8 years old, standing beside Margaret at the county fair, holding a blue ribbon for his first science project. They both looked so proud. I slid it across the table. "Your mother always said you had her heart and my stubbornness. She would have forgiven you before you even asked." Ethan picked up the photo, his thumb brushing against the faded edges. "Do you forgive me?" he asked softly. "I already did," I said. "But forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about seeing each other clearly again." He smiled through the tears, nodding. "Then I'd like to start over." We spent the rest of the morning talking, not about fame or fortune or the show, but about life, about the students I used to teach, about the places he'd traveled, about things that didn't need fixing, just living, breathing, being human again. When he left that afternoon, he hugged me for the first time in years. It wasn't the kind of hug that demands forgiveness. It was the kind that says, "I'm home again." As I watched him walk away down Main Street, sunlight breaking through the clouds, I realized something simple and profound. You can lose everything, your reputation, your possessions, even your home. But if you can rebuild love, you've already won. A year later, I found myself standing in front of the museum display again. The same grand marble hall, the same glass case, but this time the air felt different, calmer, lighter. The crowds had thinned, the reporters were gone, and the whispers had faded into the background hum of history. There it was, the box. Margaret's box. My wife's hands had once polished it. Her laughter had filled the room as she placed her jewelry inside. Now it sat under perfect lighting, admired by strangers who saw only beauty, not heartbreak. But to me, it wasn't about the gold or the crest or the $50 million. It was about her, about everything she'd taught me without saying a word. I leaned on the railing, watching people drift past. A little girl tugged her mother's sleeve and asked, "Who was Robert Callahan?" The mother smiled and read the plaque aloud. Robert and Margaret Callahan, keepers of history. A reminder that true value lies not in possession, but in preservation. The little girl looked thoughtful. "So he didn't sell it?" Her mother shook her head. "No, sweetheart. He shared it with the world." I smiled. That was enough for me. The years of shame, ridicule, and loneliness felt distant now, like an old bruise that no longer hurt when pressed. My story had traveled farther than I ever imagined. School textbooks, documentaries, even a scholarship fund bearing Margaret's name. I still lived above the bookstore, still repaired old furniture when asked, still took my walks along Main Street. The world had changed around me, but I had no desire to chase it anymore. Ethan visited often now, not every day, but enough. Sometimes we'd sit on a park bench near the river, feeding ducks like we used to when he was a boy. We didn't talk about the show or the money or even the past. We talked about the present, about books, music, small joys. Once he asked, "Do you ever wish things had been different?" I thought for a moment before answering. If they were different, son, I might never have learned what really matters. Sometimes the hardest storms reveal the clearest skies. He smiled, and I knew he understood. As I left the museum that afternoon, I took one last look at the box. The sunlight hit it just right, scattering tiny reflections across the glass. For a brief second, I imagined Margaret standing beside me, her hand slipping into mine, her voice soft and full of that familiar warmth. "You did good, Rob," she would have said. "You didn't let them take what mattered." "I just followed your lead," I whispered. Outside, the London air was cool, crisp, and alive. Tourists hurried past, the city buzzing with stories of its own. I walked slowly, breathing it all in, the laughter, the traffic, the distant bells of Big Ben. Life had come full circle. The man once called a hoarder had become a guardian of history. The son who'd betrayed me had found his way home. And the love I thought I'd lost had found new life in every person who stopped to read that plaque. Some stories don't end with applause or riches. They end quietly, with peace, forgiveness, and a sense that maybe, just maybe, everything happened exactly as it was meant to. As I crossed the street, I looked up at the sky and whispered, "We're remembered now, Margaret." And for the first time in years, I felt whole.